The moon was a sliver of bone in the blackness, casting just enough light to make the shadows long and treacherous. Kai moved through them with a silence born of a lifetime spent in a land that did not reward noise. His focus was on the tracks in the sand, the delicate four-toed print of the coyote he had been following since dusk. The animal was clever, a survivor like himself, and the hunt had become a familiar dance across the chilled expanse of the Arizona desert. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of dust and brittle creosote. It was a clean smell, the smell of emptiness, of a world washed clean by wind and sun. Then another scent drifted on the breeze, something that did not belong. It was alien and foul. Smoke first, the greasy kind from burning fat and canvas, not the clean smoke of juniper or mesquite. Beneath it was a second smell, heavier and metallic, the coppery stench of blood, and a lot of it. Kai straightened from his crouch, his head lifting, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. The coyote was forgotten. A knot of cold dread tightened in his gut, a feeling older than memory. He knew that smell. It was the perfume of violence, of a peace shattered. He moved toward the source, his moccasins making no sound on the rocky ground. He climbed a small rise, his body a low silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Below him, in a shallow basin that offered poor shelter, was the source of the smell. The remains of a small wagon train. 2 wagons, one on its side like a broken beetle, its canvas cover burned away to reveal blackened ribs of wood. The other was upright but crippled, its tongue splintered. The oxen that had pulled them were dead, their bodies bloated in dark shapes on the sand. Kai scanned the scene, his eyes missing nothing. The bright moon gave the carnage a ghostly, unreal quality. Belongings were strewn everywhere, a testament to a frantic, hopeless struggle. A rocking chair lay on its side, a child's doll with a missing arm half buried in the sand nearby. A large Bible was splayed open, its pages ruffling in the night wind as if trying to speak. He saw the bodies of the travelers, men and women. They were still. He felt no anger, only a profound and weary sadness. This land swallowed people. It swallowed their dreams and their prayers, and left only bones behind. He made his way down into the basin, his movements careful and deliberate. He was not a warrior, but he was a hunter, and the skills were much the same. He read the story of the attack in the earth. The tracks were clear. 10, maybe 12 riders. Their horses were shod with iron, a sound that would have carried far in the stillness. But there was no one to hear. The men themselves wore boots with hard heels, leaving deep, sharp imprints that were nothing like the soft press of a moccasin. These were not his people. They were not Apache or Yavapai. These were white men, outlaws by the look of it. The attack was an act of brutal robbery, not war. He examined one of the dead, a man with a graying beard and a farmer's strong hands. His pockets were turned out. Everything of value was gone. Money, weapons, horses. The bandits had been thorough. Kai followed a set of tracks leading away from the wagons, the boot prints of a large man. The tracks ended abruptly next to a large saguaro. A man lay there on his back, his eyes open to the uncaring moon. He was dressed in dusty trail clothes, a pistol still clutched in his hand. A dark stain spread across his chest. The bandits had not escaped unscathed. One of their own was left behind. Curiosity, a dangerous trait in these lands, made Kai kneel beside the body. This man had been part of the attack. His face was hard, etched with cruelty. Kai felt nothing for him. He was about to rise when something glinted on the man's vest, half tucked into a pocket. He reached out and pulled it free. It was a small brass badge, heavy and solid in his palm. It was shaped like a shield, and stamped into the metal were the letters U.S. Below them was the number of a cavalry regiment. Kai stared at it, the cold metal seeming to burn his skin. This changed everything. This was not a simple act of robbery. A piece of the United States Army lay in the pocket of a dead thief. It spoke of a dark alliance, a protection bought and paid for. of powerful men turning a blind eye. The lawlessness of the desert was one thing. The corruption of the law was something else entirely, a deeper and more dangerous poison. He let the badge fall back onto the dead man's chest. The weight of its meaning settled on him. He needed to leave. He had seen too much. This was a white man's affair, a violent secret that could be fatal to any native who stumbled upon it. His duty was to his own people, to return to their hidden camp and warn them. To stay here was to invite trouble that would surely follow. Soldiers would come to investigate. They would find the massacre, and their eyes would look for someone to blame. It was an old, familiar story. He turned to go, his decision made, but as he scanned the scene one last time, his hunter's eyes caught something else, a set of prints leading away from the slaughter, different from the others. They were small, made by shoes that were worn and thin. The stride was short, uneven, stumbling. The tracks of a woman, or perhaps a youth. They led away from the wagons, toward a dark cluster of palo verde trees huddled at the edge of the basin. Hope was a fool's game, but he followed the tracks anyway. He pushed aside a low-hanging branch and stopped. A young woman lay curled on the ground at the base of a tree, as if trying to hide from the horror. She was alive. Her breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the profound silence. Her dress was torn and stained, and one arm was bent at an unnatural angle. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was matted with dirt and something dark and wet. He knelt beside her, his movements slow so as not to startle her, though he doubted she was aware of his presence. Her face was pale in the moonlight, streaked with dust and tears. She could not have been more than 19 summers old. He saw the rise and fall of her chest, a fragile motion that seemed to be losing its fight against the stillness of the desert. She was dying. He could see it in the waxy pallor of her skin, in the blue tint of her lips. She needed a doctor, and water, and warmth. She needed a world that was not this one. Kai stood and looked back at the ruined wagons, then up at the moon. It watched him, a cold and distant eye of fate. All around him, the land was littered with the bones of creatures that had died of thirst. Cattle skulls, bleached white, were half buried in the sand, their empty sockets like mouths agape in a final, unheard cry. They were monuments to dreams that had perished in the heat. To bring this woman with him would be to carry a dream that was already dying. It was madness. He was Kai, a man of the people. His allegiance was clear. His responsibility was to the safety of his family, his tribe. This white woman was a threat. She was evidence. If she lived, her story would bring soldiers. If she died in his care, they would call it murder. There was no path that did not lead to peril. The safest thing to do, the logical thing, was to walk away, to melt back into the shadows and let the desert claim one more soul. It was the law of this place. The strong survived. The weak did not. He took a step back, his heart a hard stone in his chest. He could already feel the cool sand of the path leading home under his feet. He could see the faces of his people, safe and unaware. It was the right choice, the only choice. But he did not take another step. He looked down at the young woman again. He saw not a white woman, not an enemy or a danger. He saw a person, small and broken and alone. Her life was a tiny ember, and the wind was rising. To leave her here would be no different from the actions of the men who had done this to her. It would be a surrender to the cruelty of the world. His grandfather had once told him that a man is defined not by the battles he wins, but by the burdens he is willing to carry. The moment stretched, silent and immense. The wind whispered through the branches of the palo verde, a sound like a long, slow sigh. He had a choice between his duty and his heart, between wisdom and compassion. He knew what his people would say. They would call him a fool. He might be condemning them all with this single act. He bent down, with a gentleness that belied his strength. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She made a small sound, a murmur of pain, but did not wake. He lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder. He stood there for a long moment, feeling the warmth of her body, the faint, stuttering beat of her heart against his own. The pace of the world seemed to slow, the frantic violence of the night fading into a quiet, profound gravity. In that instant, she was not of one people and he of another. They were simply two souls in a vast and indifferent wilderness. He adjusted his hold, settling her weight more comfortably. He knew a place, a small rock shelter high on a nearby mesa, a place with a seep of fresh water that trickled from the stone, a secret known only to him. It was a long walk and a hard climb. It might be for nothing. She might die before they even arrived. And if she lived, the consequences of this night would come for him. He knew this. He accepted it. Turning his back on the carnage of the wagons and the dead men with their dark secrets, Kai began to walk. He moved toward the dark shape of the mesa, a man carrying a stranger, a burden, a flicker of hope. The desert watched him go, its silence swallowing his footsteps, and the moon, the eye of fate, followed him on his journey into the unknown. He did not look back. He just kept walking, one deliberate step after another, carrying his choice into the heart of the great and terrible emptiness. The weight on his shoulders was immense, but for the first time that night, he felt as though he could stand up straight beneath it. The climb was an agony. The mesa rose from the desert floor like a fortress wall, a sheer face of red rock and loose shale. Kai moved up it with a slow, burning rhythm, the unconscious woman a leaden weight in his arms. His muscles screamed with the effort. His lungs rasped for air. He could not afford to slip. A single misstep would send them both tumbling to their deaths on the rocks below. He pressed his face against the cool stone, gathering his strength, then pushed upward again. He focused on the next handhold, the next ledge, shutting out the pain and the exhaustion. The moon had begun its descent toward the horizon, and the first pale hint of dawn was touching the eastern sky when he finally pulled himself and his burden over the final lip of rock and onto the flat top of the mesa. He was in a different world up here. The wind was keener, the silence more profound. He carried her a short distance to the place he knew, a shallow overhang carved into the rock by centuries of wind and water. It was not a cave, but a shelter, deep enough to protect from the sun and hide from prying eyes. And at the back, in a deep fissure, was the miracle: water. It seeped from the rock, drop by precious drop, collecting in a small, hollowed-out basin in the stone floor. The water was clean and cold, the lifeblood of this high, lonely place. He laid her down gently on the sandy floor of the shelter. In the growing light of dawn, he could see her more clearly. The gash on her temple was ugly, crusted with dried blood. Her arm was clearly broken, the swelling already pronounced. He took a strip of cloth he tore from the hem of his own tunic and dipped it in the basin of water. Carefully, he began to clean the wound on her head. She moaned softly at his touch, her eyelids fluttering, but she did not wake. He worked with a focused intensity. His hands, which could track the faintest sign and skin a rabbit in minutes, were now impossibly gentle. He examined her broken arm. It would need to be set. He found two sturdy, straight branches from a hardy bush growing near the shelter's edge and stripped them of their leaves. Tearing more strips from his tunic, he took a deep breath and, with a firm, quick movement, pulled the bone back into alignment. A sharp cry escaped her lips, a sound of pure pain that echoed briefly in the stillness. He ignored his own flinch of sympathy and worked quickly, binding the splints tightly to her arm, immobilizing it. There was nothing more he could do for the break. The rest was up to her body's own will to heal. He covered her with the wolfskin he carried rolled on his back, a thick, warm pelt that was one of his most valued possessions. It had been his father's, and it held the scent of smoke and home. He tucked it around her, a gesture of profound protection, Then, he sat back on his haunches and watched her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He had done what he could. Now he had to wait. The sun climbed, and the rock shelter became a refuge from the growing heat. Kai left her side only to hunt. He moved like a ghost across the top of the mesa. His bow in hand, he returned a short time later with a plump rabbit. He built a small, smokeless fire in a pit well inside the shelter. Using dry wood that burned hot and fast, he cooked the meat, and the scent filled their small space. It was a smell of life, of sustenance. He ate his fill and set a piece aside to cool. For when she woke in the full heat of the afternoon. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the dim light. They were the color of a summer sky, a startling blue in her pale, drawn face. Her gaze drifted around the shelter, taking in the curved rock walls, the sandy floor, the faint glow of the fire's embers. Then her eyes found him. He was sitting across the small space, watching her. He saw the moment confusion turned to fear. Her eyes widened, the blue darkening with panic, her breath hitched in her throat. She tried to scramble backward, away from him, a frantic, crab-like motion that sent a jolt of pain through her broken arm. She cried out, more from terror than the physical hurt. All the stories she had ever heard in her safe Missouri home came flooding back. Stories of savages, of wild men who lived in the wilderness like animals. Her mind screamed at her. He was one of them, an Indian. He had taken her. The men who had attacked the wagons, were they his people? Was he one of them? "Stay away," she whispered, her voice a dry, cracked thing. She pushed herself back until her shoulders hit the hard rock wall. She was trapped. Kai did not move. He held her gaze, his own expression unchanging. He understood her fear. He had seen it in the eyes of white people before. It was a fear born of ignorance, of stories told around a fire. He held up his hands, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. "No hurt," he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse. The English words felt foreign on his tongue, misshapen and clumsy. "You are safe." His broken English did little to soothe her. It only seemed to confirm her fears. He was other. He was different. She shook her head, her blonde hair falling across her face. "Where am I? What do you want?" He pointed to the water basin. Water. He then pointed to the piece of cooked rabbit meat. Eat. He kept his words simple, direct. He was trying to bridge the vast gulf between their two worlds with the barest of tools. She stared at the food and water, then back at him. Her thirst was a fire in her throat. Her stomach was a hollow, aching void. But the fear was stronger. She could not accept anything from him. To do so felt like a surrender, a betrayal of her own kind. She shook her head again, pressing herself harder against the rock, as if she could merge with it and disappear. Kai saw the conflict in her eyes. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if to say he understood. He did not push. He simply stood, picked up his bow, and walked out of the shelter, leaving her alone. He needed to give her space, fear, like a cornered animal, needed room to breathe. He went to the edge of the mesa and looked out over the vast, sun-baked expanse. He could see for miles. The desert was a sea of muted color, of ochre and red and pale green. It was beautiful and terrible. Somewhere down there, the secret of the cavalry badge lay festering. Trouble was coming. He could feel it in his bones. He had tied his fate to the woman in the cave, and he did not know if it was an act of compassion or an act of suicide. He returned to the shelter as dusk began to fall. She was still huddled against the back wall, but her eyes followed his every move. He saw the desperation in them now. Thirst was a powerful enemy. He went to a prickly pear cactus growing nearby and, using his knife, carefully sliced off a thick pad. He burned off the sharp spines in the fire's embers, then expertly peeled away the tough outer skin to reveal the pale, moist flesh inside. He cut off a small piece and held it out to her, placing it on a flat rock midway between them. "Eat," he said again. "Water inside." She watched him, her breathing shallow. He made no move to come closer. He simply left the offering and retreated to his side of the shelter. For a long time, she did not move. The silence was broken only by the sound of the wind outside. Finally, slowly, she crawled forward. Her movements were hesitant, like a fawn approaching a strange object in a clearing. She picked up the piece of cactus. It felt cool and wet in her hand. She looked at him one more time. Then, driven by a thirst that was becoming unbearable, she put it in her mouth. Her face immediately contorted. The taste was green and bitter, the texture slimy. It was nothing like the cool, sweet water of the well back home. She almost spat it out, but the moisture was a relief to her parched tongue and throat. She forced herself to chew and swallow. Kai watched her reaction, and, for the first time, the faintest hint of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it changed his face, softening the hard lines. He shrugged, a simple gesture of a man stating a simple fact. "Bitter," he said, the English word sounding strange in his mouth. Bitter is better than dying of thirst. Something in his plain-spoken logic, in the shared moment of her distaste and his quiet amusement, broke through her fear. It was a tiny crack in the wall she had built around herself. But it was a start. He was not a monster. He was a man who knew how to survive in this harsh land, and right now, her survival depended entirely on him. She picked up another piece of the cactus and ate it, the bitterness a little more bearable this time. Later that night, as she lay wrapped in the heavy wolfskin, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep, she saw him get up. He moved to the entrance of the shelter and stood for a moment, a tall silhouette against the stars. Then he was gone. She felt a flicker of her earlier panic. Had he abandoned her, but a part of her, a new and unfamiliar part, knew that he would be back. Kai made his way down the treacherous face of the mesa in the darkness. He had to go back. There was one last thing he needed to do. He found the scene of the massacre unchanged, a ghostly tableau under the moon. The bodies lay where they had fallen. He went to the woman who had been near the rocking chair. He could not leave her for the vultures. Using only his hands and a flat piece of rock, he began to dig a shallow grave in the sandy soil. It was hard, slow work. The ground was unforgiving. When it was deep enough, he gently placed her in it. He stood over the grave for a long moment. He did not know her name or her god, but he knew she had been a person with hopes and dreams, and that she deserved to rest in peace. He whispered a quiet prayer in his own tongue, the language of the dying, a prayer for balance to be restored, for her spirit to find its way. He covered the grave, piling rocks on top to keep the animals away. He did not do the same for the others. He did not have the time. He had already risked too much. As he worked, his hand brushed against the child's doll with the missing arm. He picked it up and placed it on top of the rock pile, a small, sad marker for a life cut short. When he returned to the shelter, Annabelle was awake. She had watched him leave, and she had waited, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, new kind of hope. When his dark shape filled the entrance once more, she did not flinch. He came back. He had not left her. He came and sat by the fire, adding a few small sticks to the embers, bringing a soft glow back to their small world. He did not speak, and neither did she, but the silence between them was different now. It was no longer a silence of fear and mistrust. It was something else, the beginning of a fragile, unspoken understanding, a shared space in the vast, dangerous, and lonely heart of the desert. He had covered her with his father's wolfskin, and she had eaten the food he had provided. Without a word, a treaty had been struck between them. For now, they were a tribe of two. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, a life stripped down to its barest essentials. The world became the rock shelter, the wide expanse of the mesa top, and the vast, silent sky. Annabelle's fear slowly receded. replaced by a weary acceptance and a growing, unspoken reliance on the quiet man who had saved her. Her arm ached with a deep, throbbing pain, but the fever had broken. Her strength began to return, a little more each day. She learned to eat the bitter cactus without wincing and to savor the taste of rabbit meat roasted over the small, careful fire. Kai was a constant, steady presence. He was a man of few words, and the English he knew was a sparse collection of nouns and verbs, but he communicated in other ways. He showed her which roots were safe to eat, how to find them by the shape of their leaves. He taught her the names of the birds that circled high above the mesa. He moved with an economy of motion, a purposefulness that she found calming. There was no wasted energy, no wasted sound. In his silence, she found a kind of peace she had never known. He would sit for hours, mending a tear in his moccasin or sharpening an arrowhead. His focus absolute. Sometimes she would watch him, this man from a world so different from her own, and a strange feeling would stir in her chest. It was not fear, but something akin to wonder. He never came too close. He maintained a respectful distance, a small but uncrossable space between them in the shelter. He gave her the warmth of the fire and the protection of the wolfskin, but he asked for nothing in return. One afternoon, he brought her a small, brightly colored feather, a flash of impossible blue, and laid it on the rock beside her. He said nothing, just met her eyes for a moment before turning away. Annabelle picked it up. It was the first beautiful thing she had touched since the attack. She tucked it carefully into a fold of her torn dress. Her name, she had told him, was Annabelle Stewart. She said it slowly, pointing to her chest. He repeated it, the sounds soft and unfamiliar in his mouth. Annabelle? He pointed to himself. Kai. It was the first real exchange between them, the first naming of their separate worlds. It was Kai who saw it first. He was standing at the edge of the mesa, a tall silhouette against the brilliant afternoon sun. When his body went still, Annabelle, who was sitting near the entrance of the shelter, noticed the change immediately. Every line of his body had become taut, alert. She followed his gaze out into the desert below. At first, she saw nothing but the shimmering heat haze rising from the valley floor. Then she saw it, a smudge of dust in the distance, a faint, dirty cloud moving slowly toward them. Kai turned and came back to the shelter, his face grim. His eyes were dark with a look she had not seen before. It was not fear, but a cold, hard certainty. He pointed toward the dust cloud. Horses, he said, the single word hanging in the air like a death sentence. He stamped out the last of the fire's embers, scattering the ashes. He gestured for her to move deeper into the shadows of the overhang. Annabelle's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Horses meant riders. Riders meant they had been found. She thought of the men who had attacked the wagon train. Then another, more terrifying thought came to her. Soldiers. They would think he had taken her. They would not listen. They would not understand. They watched as the dust cloud grew larger, resolving itself into a line of riders. They wore blue, the dark blue of the United States Cavalry. Annabelle felt a surge of desperate, confused hope, but it died the moment she looked at Kai's face. He saw no rescue coming. He saw only a different kind of danger. The soldiers reached the base of the mesa and stopped. There were 6 of them. One, a man with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, dismounted and studied the ground. He was a thick-set man with a hard, sunburnt face and a mouth set in a permanent line of disapproval. He pointed up toward the mesa face, toward the faint trail Kai had used. He had found their tracks. Stay here, Kai whispered, his voice urgent. He pushed her farther back into the deepest part of the shelter, behind a large pillar of rock. He grabbed his bow and a quiver of arrows. His movements were fluid and silent. The wait was an eternity. Annabelle could hear the scrape of boots on rock, the muttered curses of the climbing soldiers. Her breath was trapped in her lungs. She pressed herself against the cold stone, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. Kai stood just out of sight of the entrance. An arrow knocked on his bowstring, his body as still as the rock around him. The first soldier to pull himself over the ledge was a young man, barely more than a boy, with a nervous face. He was followed by the sergeant. The man's eyes scanned the mesa top, missing nothing. They fixed on the entrance to the shelter, a dark slash in the rock. He drew his pistol. "Come on out of there," Sergeant Doyle shouted, his voice a harsh command that echoed off the rock. "We know you are in there." He saw a flicker of movement, the edge of Annabelle's pale dress. He saw the wolf skin on the floor. His eyes narrowed, and his hard face grew harder. He saw what he expected to see. A white woman, captured, a savage in his lair. "Annabelle," Kai said in a low voice, his back still to her. "Do not make a sound." Doyle took a step forward, his pistol raised. "I said come out, send the girl out first." Annabelle could not stay silent. This was all a terrible mistake. "No," she cried, her voice thin and high. "You do not understand. He saved me." Her words were lost in the sharp crack of a rifle shot. One of the other soldiers, seeing Kai's silhouette against the dim light of the shelter, had fired. The bullet splintered the rock just inches from Kai's head, showering him with stone fragments. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Instinct took over. Kai loosed his arrow. Not at the men, but at the ground near their feet. It was a warning. The soldiers answered with another volley of shots. Bullets whined through the air, striking the back wall of the shelter. Annabelle screamed, covering her head with her good arm. Kai grabbed her, pulling her down. "We have to go," he hissed. He knew this place. He knew its secrets. There was another way out. He pushed her toward a narrow fissure in the back of the shelter, a crack barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Outside, Sergeant Doyle was directing his men. "Spread out. He is trapped. Miller, you and Jones go around that side. Do not let him get away." He was not listening to Annabelle's cries. He was a man with a simple, clear mission. Rescue the captive. Kill the captor. Kai fired another arrow, this one arcing high over the soldiers' heads and down toward the base of the mesa where their horses were tethered. He was not aiming for the animals, but for the rocks near them. The arrow clattered loudly, and the horses, already spooked by the gunfire, reared and pulled at their reins. One broke free, galloping away in a blind panic. It was the chaos he needed. A few moments of distraction. He pushed Annabelle toward the fissure again. "Go," he commanded. She scrambled into the narrow opening, her body scraping against the rough stone. Kai followed right behind her, a shield between her and the soldiers. The young soldier named Miller, eager to prove himself, scrambled along a narrow ledge to try and cut off their escape. He was reckless, moving too quickly on the treacherous footing. As Kai and Annabelle disappeared into the rock, Miller took one more step. His boot slipped on a patch of loose shale. He cried out, his arms flailing as he fought for balance. For a heart-stopping moment, he seemed to hang in the air. Then he was gone. His scream was cut short by a sickening thud from far below. Sergeant Doyle heard the scream. He ran to the edge and looked down. He saw the crumpled blue shape of Miller's body lying on the rocks. A cold, black rage filled him. A rage that burned away any possibility of reason or doubt. The savage had killed one of his men. This was no longer a rescue. It was a hunt. Vengeance was the only law that mattered now. "He killed him," Doyle roared, his voice cracking with fury. "The bastard killed Miller. I want him. I want him dead." The fissure opened out onto another ledge, hidden from the front of the mesa. It was a narrow, precarious path that snaked its way along the cliff face. Kai took Annabelle's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. Her mind was reeling. The sudden violence, the gunshots, the shouts. It was a nightmare. "He thinks you killed him," she said, her voice trembling. "He thinks you are a murderer." Kai did not answer. He just pulled her along the ledge, his focus entirely on their escape. They could hear Doyle's shouts behind them, the sounds of the other soldiers trying to find a way to follow. The path was dangerous. In places, it was no wider than the length of a man's foot. A single slip would be fatal. Annabelle closed her eyes, trusting the strong hand that was guiding her, feeling the solid presence of the man in front of her. They reached a place where the ledge ended in a steep, nearly vertical drop of 20 feet. A dead end. But Kai knew this place. He pointed to a thick, gnarled root that protruded from the cliff face, the tenacious hold of an ancient, twisted juniper. He wrapped his hands around it, testing its strength. It was solid. He looked at Annabelle. There was no time for words. He put his hands on her waist and helped her over the edge, guiding her feet until they found small holds in the rock. "Go down," he said. She obeyed without question, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. She scrambled down the rock face, her fingers raw, her torn dress catching on the rough stone. Kai followed, moving with the agility of a mountain goat. They reached the bottom and did not stop. Kai led her into a labyrinth of canyons and washes that cut through the base of the mesa. He moved with a sure and certain knowledge of the land, twisting and turning, always choosing the path that would leave the least sign. Hours later, when they were miles away and hidden in a deep, shadowed arroyo, they finally stopped. Annabelle collapsed onto the sand, her body shaking with exhaustion and reaction. Kai stood over her, listening, his head cocked, his senses reaching out into the desert. The only sound was the wind. For now, they were safe. But everything had changed. The fragile piece of their shelter was gone, shattered by the blast of a rifle. Before, they were two strangers brought together by tragedy. Now, they were fugitives, bound together by a shared danger. A cloud of dust and death was following them, a storm of prejudice and vengeance that would not be easily outrun. The desert was no longer just a harsh and indifferent wilderness. It had become a hunting ground, and they were the prey. The flight was a blur of rock and sand, of thirst and a gnawing, constant fear. They moved by night, resting during the brutal heat of the day in whatever shallow caves or overhangs Kai could find. He was a master of the unseen path, leaving a trail so faint that only another like him could ever hope to follow it. But the land was not their only enemy. Annabelle's arm was a source of constant, agonizing pain. The rough splint had served its purpose, but the swelling was angry and red, and a fever was beginning to return to her eyes. Kai knew the language of wounds. This one was poisoned. If she did not get proper care soon, she would lose the arm, or her life. There was only one choice, a desperate gamble that made his stomach tighten with dread. They had to find a town. A town meant people, and people meant danger. It meant eyes that would see a white woman with an Indian, and minds that would leap to the darkest conclusions. But it also meant the chance of a real doctor, of clean bandages and medicine. He led them toward the thin, dark line that had recently scarred the horizon. The railroad. It was a thing he hated, an iron snake that was slowly strangling the life out of the land he knew. But the snake had brought with it nests of men, towns that sprouted like bitter weeds along its path. One of these was a place called Dusty Ford. It was little more than a collection of raw lumber buildings and canvas tents huddled around a water tower. A place of noise and frantic energy, reeking of coal smoke, whiskey, and desperation. It was the last place on earth he wanted to be, which made it the perfect place to hide. They stopped at the edge of the chaotic settlement, concealed in a thicket of mesquite. "I will wait here," Kai said, his voice a low murmur. "You go. Find help for your arm. Get food." He handed her a small deerskin pouch. Inside were a few silver coins he had acquired through trade long ago. It was nearly everything he had. Annabelle looked from the coins to his face. To go in there alone was terrifying. But she saw the hard necessity in his eyes. He could not go with her. His presence would bring the very trouble they were trying to avoid. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. First, she needed to look the part. Her dress was in tatters, a clear signal of a victim, from his own sparse pack. Kai produced a pair of rough-spun trousers and a man's shirt. They were worn and faded, but clean. Annabelle looked at them in dismay. She had never worn such things in her life. With fumbling fingers, she changed behind the cover of the bushes. The fabric was coarse against her skin. The trousers were too big in the waist, and she had to hold them up with a piece of rope Kai provided. The worst part was the boots. He had managed to trade for them from a prospector days earlier. They were heavy, stiff, and too large. When she tried to walk, she stumbled, the boots clumping loudly on the hard ground. She felt clumsy and utterly exposed. Kai watched her, his expression unreadable. He shook his head slowly. "You are making noise like a cow pulling a plow," he observed, his English flat and direct. Annabelle's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. "I cannot help it," she snapped. "I have never worn such horrible things." A rare, fleeting ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Walk soft," he advised. "The earth is not your enemy." She took a deep breath and tried again, concentrating, trying to mimic the way he moved, placing her feet with care. She was still clumsy, but the noise lessened. She tied her blonde hair back with a leather thong and pulled her hat down low to shadow her face. She looked less like a victim now, and more like a half-grown boy who had had a rough time of it. It would have to do. She walked into Dusty Ford, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The town was a raw wound on the landscape. The main street was a river of mud and filth, churned by the passage of wagons and horses. Men with hard, sun-scoured faces lounged on the porches of the saloon and the general store, their eyes missing nothing. Annabelle kept her own eyes down, her hand clutching the small pouch of coins inside her pocket. She found what she was looking for at the end of the street, a 2-story wooden building with a faded sign that read boarding house, rooms and meals. A smaller sign in the window promised the services of a doctor. She pushed the door open and entered a dim, quiet room that smelled of boiled laundry and carbolic soap. A woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense face looked up from behind a counter. "Can I help you?" "I need a doctor," Annabelle said, her voice barely a whisper. She held up her injured arm. The woman's expression softened slightly. "Let me see." She led Annabelle into a back room that served as a small clinic, with practiced hands. She unwrapped the dirty bandages. She clicked her tongue at the sight of the angry, swollen flesh. "You are lucky, girl, another day or two. And this would have been a bad business. My name is Martha." Martha cleaned the wound, her touch firm but gentle. She applied a foul-smelling poultice and bound the arm with clean white linen, fashioning a proper sling. As she worked, she asked quiet questions. Annabelle gave her a shortened, edited version of the truth. A wagon accident. Her family was gone. She was alone. It was a common enough story in this land, and Martha did not press for details. "You will need to stay off your feet for a few days," Martha said when she was finished. "Let the medicine do its work. I have a room upstairs you can have. It is not much, but it is clean." Annabelle paid for the room and the treatment. Her few coins were almost gone. She knew she had to retrieve one last thing. It was a foolish, sentimental risk, but she could not leave it behind. At the general store, she had seen a sign for a pawnbroker. She went there, her new boots still feeling awkward and loud on the wooden floor. She took off the thin gold locket she wore around her neck, a final gift from her mother. It was the only thing of value she had left. The pawnbroker, a small man with shifty eyes, gave her a pittance for it as he was putting the locket away. Annabelle's eyes scanned the dusty shelves behind him. Her breath caught in her throat. There, among a pile of junk, was a familiar leather satchel. It had belonged to her father. It bore his initials, embossed in the worn leather. Scavengers must have picked the wreck clean and sold what they found. "That bag," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "How much for the bag?" The broker named a price that was more than the locket had brought her. With a heavy heart, she pushed the rest of her coins across the counter. It left her with nothing But she could not leave her father's satchel in this grubby little shop. She took the bag and hurried back to the boarding house, locking herself in her small, plain room. Her hands trembled as she opened the satchel. Inside were a few of his personal effects, a book of poetry, a dull razor, and a letter. It was from his business partner, written just before they had set out on their journey. She unfolded the stiff paper. Most of it was business. Talk of land prices and prospects, but the last paragraph made her blood run cold. Rest assured, it read, our military intermediary has guaranteed safe passage through the territory. He has given his word that the route will be kept clear of any trouble. The man is expensive, but his influence is undeniable. She read the words again and again. A military intermediary. Guaranteed safe passage. It was not a random attack. It was a betrayal. Someone in the army. Someone with influence. Had taken her father's money and then led them into a trap. The cavalry badge Kai had found on the dead bandit was not a coincidence. It was a link in a chain of corruption and murder. And Sergeant Doyle, with his quick, unthinking rage. Was he a part of it? Or was he just a pawn? A man whose own prejudice made him the perfect tool. Meanwhile, in the smoky haze of the town's largest saloon, a man named Crow watched the comings and goings through narrowed eyes. He looked like a prosperous cattleman, dressed in good quality clothes, but there was a cold stillness about him that did not fit the part. He was the leader of the men who had attacked the wagon train. His operation was clever. He and his men, all white, would sometimes dress in a crude imitation of native garb to spread fear and confusion, ensuring that any investigation went in the wrong direction. The local military presence, paid for through a quiet arrangement, made sure to look the other way. The massacre of the Stewart party had been just another piece of business, but it had gone wrong. One of his men had been killed, and worse, a witness had escaped. One of his men, a lanky cowboy with a stupid grin, sidled up to his table. "Boss," he said in a low voice, "that new girl over at the boarding house, she matches the description. Blonde hair, young, looks like she has been through hell." Crow did not react, but a cold light flickered in his eyes. He had assumed she had died in the desert. This was a loose end he had to tie up. A witness could unravel his entire profitable enterprise. "Take care of it," he said softly, his voice a quiet hiss. "Tonight, no noise, no mess. Just make her disappear." That night, as the town settled into a drunken stupor, Kai watched from the darkness. He had seen the men go into the saloon. He had seen them talking to Crow, a man whose face he recognized from wanted posters. And now he saw two of those same men creeping through the back alleys, moving toward the boarding house. They were not making a social call. He could not risk a direct confrontation. He had no gun, only his bow and his wits. He needed a diversion, something loud and confusing. He saw his chance at the end of the rail yard. A flat car loaded with freshly cut lumber sat on a siding, attached to a small engine that was building up steam for an early morning run. He moved like a shadow, slipping through the yard. He found a pile of discarded iron couplings and, with all his strength, hurled one onto the tin roof of the railway office. The crash was enormous in the night silence, like a thunderclap. Lights came on. Men shouted. It was the distraction he needed. He circled around to the back of the boarding house. Annabelle's room was on the second floor, its window facing the alley. He scooped up a handful of pebbles and threw them against the glass. Annabelle was not asleep. The words of the letter burned in her mind. She heard the soft click of her door latch. Someone was trying to get in. Terror seized her. Then she heard the rattle of the pebbles on her window. She ran to it and looked out. Kai was below, a dark shape in the moonlight. He pointed toward the rail yard. The door to her room splintered open. Two brutish figures filled the doorway. Annabelle did not scream. She threw open the window and scrambled out onto the narrow overhang of the porch roof. It was a short drop to the ground. She landed hard, jarring her broken arm, a gasp of pain escaping her lips. Kai was there. He grabbed her hand and pulled her into a run. They fled through the alleys, the shouts of Crow's men behind them. They reached the rail yard just as the train engine gave a great hiss of steam and began to move, pulling its single car of lumber. "Up," Kai commanded, hoisting her onto the flat car. He swung up behind her. They crawled behind the stacks of wood, concealing themselves as the train slowly chugged out of Dusty Ford. They were moving, escaping into the blackness of the night. Annabelle lay panting, her heart a wild drum. She clutched the leather satchel containing her father's letter. It was no longer just a memento. It was evidence. It was a death warrant. And as the lights of the town receded behind them, she knew they were no longer just running from the law. They were running from a conspiracy that reached into the very army that was supposed to protect them. The stakes had been raised, and the game had become infinitely more deadly. The lumber car swayed and jolted with a rough, rhythmic cadence, a mechanical heartbeat carrying them deeper into the darkness. They huddled behind a tall stack of raw pine, the clean, sharp scent of sap, a stark contrast to the coal smoke and grime of the engine. Annabelle, her body trembling with the aftermath of their escape, clutched the leather satchel to her chest as if it were a shield. Inside, her father's letter felt heavy, a dangerous truth that had transformed her from a victim into a liability for powerful men. Kai was a still, silent presence beside her, his senses alert, his gaze fixed on the receding lights of Dusty Ford until they were swallowed completely by the vast, black emptiness of the desert night. They jumped from the slow-moving train before the first hint of dawn, landing in the soft sand of a dry wash. The train continued on its iron path, its sounds fading until only the whisper of the wind remained. They were once again alone in the immense silence of the land. But this time, their flight had a new urgency, a new direction. Kai looked at Annabelle, at the exhaustion etched on her face and the dirty but well-made bandage on her arm. He knew that the world of white men, with its towns and its laws, offered no safety for them. There was only one place left to go: home. He led her away from the railroad, turning toward a series of broken, jagged hills that rose like teeth against the pale morning sky. The journey was different now. Before, he had guided her through a hostile landscape. Now, he was leading her into his own. The country began to change, the barren flats giving way to winding canyons and hidden arroyos. There was more life here. Patches of tough grass clung to the slopes, and the cottonwood trees that grew along the bottoms of the washes were a vibrant, hopeful green. He showed her a small spring, its water clear and sweet, and for the first time in days, they drank their fill without fear or rationing. After 2 days of walking, they entered a long, narrow canyon whose walls were stained with stripes of red and ochre. The canyon twisted and turned, a natural maze that would be impassable to anyone who did not know its secrets. It finally opened into a place of breathtaking beauty. It was a small, hidden valley, a bowl of green cupped in the hands of the surrounding red rock cliffs. A clear stream meandered through a meadow of tall grass, its banks lined with ancient, shady trees. The air was cooler here, filled with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers. Small, sturdy dwellings, hogans made of mud and logs, were scattered beneath the trees. This was the home of his people, a sanctuary hidden from the world. Annabelle stood at the edge of the valley, her heart aching with a strange mixture of awe and sorrow. It was so peaceful, so untouched. After the violence and the fear, it felt like a dream. She saw Kai's shoulders relax, the tension of the fugitive easing from his body. This was his place. The land knew him. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. A group of men and boys, returning from a hunt with 2 deer slung over their shoulders, stopped dead at the sight of them. Their faces, open and laughing a moment before, hardened into masks of suspicion and disbelief, their eyes fixed on Annabelle, on her pale skin and blonde hair, a beacon of the outside world in their secluded home. The leader of the hunting party was a man named Chaitan. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a landscape of hard angles and fierce pride. He was a man who saw the world in the sharp, clear lines of duty and tradition. He looked from Annabel to Kai, and his eyes narrowed with a cold, unforgiving fire. He did not see a woman in need. He saw a threat, a contamination, the seed of a disaster that Kai had foolishly brought into their midst. "What have you done?" Chaitan's voice was low and dangerous, each word a stone cast at Kai. He spoke in the language of the Dain, a language Annabel could not understand, but the fury in his tone was unmistakable. Kai did not flinch. He met Chaitan's gaze, his own face calm. "I did what was right." Chaitan's laugh was a harsh, bitter sound. "Right, you bring a white woman into our hidden valley, a woman who will be hunted by soldiers and bandits alike. You lead our enemies to our doorstep, and you call that right? You have forgotten your duty to your people." Word of their arrival spread through the camp like a brush fire. People emerged from their hogans, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and anger. The children stopped their play to stare, their dark eyes wide. The women, who had been grinding corn or mending clothes, gathered in small, murmuring groups. The peaceful valley was now a sea of turmoil, and Annabel was the stone that had been thrown into its placid waters. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, and she shrank back, wishing the earth would open and swallow her. Kai was led to the center of the camp, to the large communal fire pit. Chaitan and the other hunters walked beside him, their expressions grim. Annabel was herded along with them, an exhibit in a trial that had already been decided. An impromptu council of the elders was convened. They sat in a solemn circle, their faces weathered and wise, creased with the cares of their people. Chaitan stood before them and spoke, his voice ringing with passionate conviction. He pointed a finger at Kai, then at Annabel. He spoke of the long and bloody history between their people and the whites. He spoke of treaties broken, of land stolen, of families destroyed. He argued that the law of their ancestors was clear. To shelter one of the enemy was to invite the destruction of all. Kai, he declared, had committed a profound betrayal. The woman was a danger, a walking plague, and Kai's personal feelings could not be allowed to jeopardize the safety of the entire community. When he had finished, a heavy silence fell over the gathering. All eyes turned to Kai. He stood straight and tall, his face betraying no emotion. He spoke, not with Chaitan's fire, but with a quiet, unshakable intensity. He told them of the massacre at the wagon train, of finding the girl near death. He spoke of his choice, to leave her to die or to carry her to safety. "I did not see a white woman," he said, his voice carrying in the stillness. "I saw a human being whose life was a small flame in a great wind. Our laws are meant to protect life, not to command us to turn our backs on the dying. If our traditions make us cruel, then they are no longer traditions worth keeping." Annabel watched, her heart twisting with a helpless anguish. She could not understand the words, but she could see the division in the faces around the fire. She saw the fear and anger in the eyes of many, but in others, she saw a flicker of doubt, of sympathy. She had to speak. She had to make them understand. She stepped forward, her legs trembling. All eyes turned to her. She looked at the circle of old men, her own blue eyes pleading. "Please," she began, her voice cracking. "Please, you must listen. He saved me. My family was killed. I was left to die. This man, Kai, he carried me. He healed me. He protected me. He is not a traitor. He is a good man, a brave man." She spoke with all the passion in her soul, but the words were just sounds to them, a meaningless river of English. A few of the women in the crowd softened at the sight of her tears, at the genuine desperation in her voice. They saw not an enemy, but a frightened girl, alone and in pain. But others turned away, their faces hard and unforgiving. She was the source of the conflict, the disruption of their peace. One of the elders, a man named Hastian, whose face was a map of 100 winters, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it commanded the attention of everyone present. He looked at Chaitan, then at Kai, and his old eyes were filled with a deep, weary sadness. "The law is a strong rope," Hastian said slowly. "It is meant to bind us together, to keep our community from straying into danger. But sometimes a rope can become a noose. We have all heard Chaitan, who speaks for the safety of our people, and his words are wise. We have heard Kai, who speaks for the duty of a man's heart, and his words are true. I ask you, my brothers, when the law and the human heart are in conflict, which one can save our future?" His question hung in the air, unanswered. The council was divided. To condemn Kai was to deny the compassion that was a core value of their people, but to condone his action was to accept a risk that could lead to their annihilation. They could not reach a decision. Finally, a temporary judgment was passed, a compromise between the two factions. Kai would be punished for breaking the law and bringing an outsider into their land, but he would not be exiled or put to death. Not yet. 2 men came forward with ropes. They led Kai to a thick wooden post set firmly in the ground near the council fire, a post used for tanning hides and for public shaming. Kai did not resist. He stood before the post with a quiet dignity, his face a mask of stoicism. They bound his wrists and tied him securely to the post, pulling the ropes tight until they cut into his flesh. He was to remain there for 2 days and 2 nights, exposed to the sun and the cold, a public spectacle of his transgression. It was a ritual of purification, a way to cleanse the taint of his contact with the outside world. After that, the council would meet again to decide his ultimate fate, and the fate of the woman he had saved. Annabelle cried out, a strangled sob of protest. As they tied him, she tried to rush forward, but one of the women held her back, her grip firm but not unkind. Annabelle was forced to watch, her heart breaking with guilt and helplessness. This was her fault. He was being punished for an act of kindness toward her. The crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their tasks, but the tension remained. The camp was no longer a sanctuary. It was a courtroom, a prison. The cook fires, usually a symbol of warmth and community, now seemed to burn with the simmering heat of judgment. Annabelle was led to an empty hogan at the edge of the camp and left alone. Through the open doorway, she could see Kai, a solitary, defiant figure tied to the post, a symbol of the terrible choice between law and mercy, between the safety of the many and the life of one. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the small, hidden valley. From the dark, cool interior of the hogan, Annabelle watched Kai endure its punishment. He was a statue of defiance, tied to the rough-hewn post in the center of the camp. He did not cry out, did not sag against his bonds. He simply stood, his face turned toward the distant canyon wall, his expression unreadable, but she could see the dark lines of pain etched around his eyes, the way the sun burned his exposed skin, the faint, dark stain of blood where the ropes had chafed his wrists raw. Every moment of his suffering was a new wound in her own heart. This was her fault. Her existence was his crime. The day crawled by with the speed of a dying snail. The life of the camp, which had seemed so idyllic upon her arrival, was now a source of torment. The laughter of children felt like a mockery. The quiet industry of the women felt like an accusation. She was an alien body, and the community was trying to purge the infection she represented. Some of the women, moved by a pity that transcended tribe and race, left a bowl of water and a piece of flatbread near the entrance to her hogan. They would not look at her, would not speak, but the offerings were a lifeline of humanity in a sea of condemnation. Others, loyal to Chaitan's hard line of thinking, would stare at her with open hostility, their dark eyes promising no mercy. Chaitan himself was a constant presence, a circling hawk, ensuring the council's judgment was carried out to the letter. Night fell, bringing a deceptive relief. The brutal heat of the sun was replaced by the biting cold of the high desert. Annabelle huddled under a thin blanket, but the chill she felt was bone deep, a coldness of the soul. She watched the stars emerge, cold and distant, The same stars that had watched over them in the rock shelter on the mesa. That world, their private world of two, felt a lifetime away, out by the central fire pit. Kai's silhouette was a dark gash against the embers. He had to be freezing, yet he stood as still and silent as the rock that surrounded them. She must have dozed, a shallow, troubled sleep, because a slight sound at the entrance of the hogan startled her awake. A figure stood there, a shadow against the star-dusted sky. Her heart leaped with fear, but the man did not move to enter. It was Hastian, the old elder whose sad, wise eyes had seen the conflict in Kai's heart. He stood there for a long moment, a silent observer. When he spoke, his voice was a dry whisper, like leaves skittering across stone. He spoke in broken, heavily accented English, words he must have learned long ago and rarely used. "The rope of the law is strong," he said, his voice barely carrying to her. "It holds a people together, but a heart is also a strong thing. Sometimes the strongest." He reached into the folds of his blanket and produced a small object. He tossed it gently onto the dirt floor of the hogan. It landed with a soft thud. A knife. The handle was carved from bone, the blade a shard of dark, sharp obsidian. It was a woman's tool, used for cutting threads and preparing food, not a weapon of war. "Let your hearts decide what is to be done," Hastian whispered. His eyes seemed to look right through her, into the core of her spirit. "But do not bring shame upon this tribe. There has been enough sorrow." And then he was gone, melting back into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. Annabelle stared at the knife. It was a test, a choice, a terrible and wonderful permission. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The bone handle was smooth and cool in her palm. "Let your hearts decide." She looked out at the solitary figure at the post. Her heart had already decided. It had decided in a dusty rock shelter, over a piece of bitter cactus. It had decided on a narrow cliffside ledge, with a strong hand holding hers. She waited until the camp was deep in slumber, until the last fires had burned down to faint red eyes in the darkness. She slipped out of the hogan, a ghost in her tattered clothes, the small knife clutched in her hand. The ground was cold under her bare feet. Every pebble, every twig seemed a threat, a potential sound that could betray her. She moved with a slowness that was agony, her gaze fixed on the man at the post. He heard her approach, his head lifted slightly. He did not speak, but she felt his awareness, a sudden, sharp focus in the stillness. She stopped in front of him, so close she could feel the faint warmth still radiating from his body. In the dim light of the moon, she could see the raw, abraded flesh of his wrists, the exhaustion that even his pride could not fully conceal. The sweet, metallic scent of his blood mingled with the sharp, clean smell of the pine resin from the post. She raised the knife. He watched her, his eyes dark and unreadable pools of shadow. He did not know what she intended. She saw a flicker of something in his gaze, a surrender to whatever came next. She pressed the sharp edge of the obsidian blade against the thick rope binding his right wrist. The fibers were tough, resistant. She had to saw at them, her movements clumsy in her haste and fear. The rope gave way with a soft snap. She moved to the other wrist, her fingers brushing against his skin. It was the first time she had touched him with deliberate tenderness. A jolt went through her, a current of profound connection that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with a recognition of the soul. He drew a sharp, unsteady breath. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the sheer, overwhelming weight of the moment. She started on the second rope. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the knife. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image. This was more than just cutting him free. This was an act of claiming, a declaration that his fate was bound to hers. This was her vow. She looked up at his face, into his dark, waiting eyes, and the words came from a place so deep within her she did not know it existed. Her voice was a ragged whisper, a breath of sound lost in the vastness of the night. "Untie me slowly. It was a plea and a prayer. Untie me from my past, from my grief, from the world that has tried to destroy me. Untie me from my fear. Show me how to be free. For a long moment, he was silent, so still he might have been carved from the same dark rock as the canyon walls. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rasp, raw with thirst and emotion, a sound that seemed torn from the very earth beneath their feet. It was a confession, an oath, a complete and total surrender. God, he breathed, the name a strange and holy thing on his lips. I am already yours. The second rope fell away. His hands were free, but he did not move. He stood there, his arms still held as if by phantom bonds. Annabelle let the knife fall to the dirt. She reached up and placed her hands on his chest. She could feel the wild, frantic beating of his heart, a rhythm that matched her own. He slowly, hesitantly, brought his arms around her, his touch unsure at first, then firm, pulling her against him. They held each other in the darkness, a silent, desperate embrace that was a world unto itself. It was not a kiss, not a caress. It was shelter. It was an anchor in a raging sea. They stood in the very center of the community that had condemned them, in the heart of their prison, and for a few timeless moments, they were the only two people in the universe. They were no longer a white woman and an Indian, a victim and a savior. They were just a man and a woman who had found each other in the ruins of their lives, and in that finding, had discovered a freedom more profound than any law or any judgment. They did not speak again. There were no more words. They stayed that way until the first pale gray light of dawn began to touch the eastern rim of the canyon. They broke their embrace slowly, reluctantly. The world was returning, and with it, the consequences of their choice. As the camp began to stir, as the first wisps of smoke rose from the morning fires, Annabelle did something she would not have had the strength to do just a day before. She did not hide. She did not run. She took Kai's hand, her fingers lacing through his. His hand was rough and calloused, but his grip was gentle. Together, they walked to the center of the camp and stood beside the empty post of judgment. She did not need to speak their language. Her actions spoke for her. When the elders emerged, when Shaitan came forward with a look of thunder on his face, she did not flinch. She stood tall, her hand in Kai's, and met their gazes. Her eyes, clear and unwavering, made a silent declaration. This man belongs to me, and I belong to him. His fate is my fate. Judge him, and you judge me, too. She had been untied, and in that freedom, she had chosen her bonds. The dawn was cold and sharp, the light cutting across the canyon rim and spilling into the valley. A collective gasp went through the camp as the people emerged from their hogans. It was not the empty punishment post that shocked them, but the two figures standing beside it, Kai and Annabelle. They stood hand in hand, a silent, unshakable unit against the world. It was a declaration more potent than any words, an act of open defiance against the council's judgment and the tribe's sacred law. Shaitan's face, when he saw them, became a mask of cold fury. This was not just a broken rule, it was a profound insult to the traditions that held his world together. The woman had bewitched him, turned him from his people. The shame was a fire in his blood. He strode forward, his footsteps heavy on the packed earth, and stopped before them. He did not address Annabelle. To him, she was an irrelevance, a ghost. His eyes, burning with a righteous fire, were fixed on Kai. You have shamed your ancestors. Shaitan's voice was a low growl. You have chosen this thing over your blood. There is only one way to wash such a stain from our land. Taha Agilo. The words fell into the morning air with the weight of granite. Taha Agilo. The duel of honor. It was the final arbiter, an ancient and brutal rite reserved for the gravest of disputes. It was not a fight to the death, but a ritual combat to first blood, to prove which man's spirit was stronger, whose path was truer. The loser would be exiled in disgrace. It was a challenge that could not be refused. Kai's jaw tightened, but he gave a slow, deliberate nod. This was inevitable. It was the only way this could end. A silent, powerful current moved through the crowd. The people began to form a circle, a thick, human wall around the two men. It was a movement born of ancient instinct, the formation of a court older than any building, any written law. Women and children, elders and hunters, they all pressed in, their faces grim and unreadable. They were no longer individuals, they were the tribe, a single entity about to witness a painful, necessary surgery. Annabelle was pushed to the edge of the circle, her hand torn from Kai's. She could only watch, a helpless spectator at a trial she could not comprehend. In the center of the circle, the two men faced each other. The space between them crackled with a tension that was almost visible. They removed their tunics, standing bare-chested in the cool morning air. Someone brought them the knives. They were short, with heavy blades designed for close, brutal work. The steel gleamed, catching the first rays of the sun. They began to circle each other, a slow, predatory dance on the red sand. Their styles were a perfect contrast, a clash of philosophies made manifest in flesh and steel. Chaitan was a force of nature, a bear. He was bigger, stronger, his movements grounded and powerful. He held his knife in a forward grip, relying on brute strength and relentless pressure to overwhelm his opponent. He was the embodiment of the unbending law, the weight of tradition. Kai was water, a river reed. He was leaner, quicker, his movements fluid and economical. He held his knife in a reverse grip, the blade an extension of his forearm, a tool for deflection and lightning-fast counters. He was the embodiment of the individual heart, adapting, yielding, but impossible to contain. Chaitan lunged first, a bellow tearing from his throat. It was a straightforward, powerful thrust meant to end the fight quickly. Kai was not there. He flowed to the side, the blade whispering past his ribs, and his own knife flickered out, leaving a shallow, stinging cut on Chaitan's forearm. It was a point scored, a message sent. But it only served to enrage the larger man. The duel became a maelstrom of motion. Chaitan was a storm of aggression, his knife a blur of heavy, hacking blows. Kai was a master of evasion, a ghost who was never where the blade fell. He gave ground, letting Chaitan's own momentum work against him, using the larger man's rage to create openings. He scored again, a thin red line on Chaitan's shoulder, but he could not keep this up forever. Chaitan's raw power was wearing him down, forcing him into smaller and smaller spaces. The circle of people seemed to press in, the air growing thick, heavy, and hard to breathe. Annabelle watched, her hands pressed to her mouth, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She saw Kai's focus, the absolute concentration in his eyes, but she also saw the sweat beading on his forehead, the slight tremor of fatigue in his muscles. He was fighting for her, for them, and the weight of that knowledge was a physical blow. Then it happened. In a backward step to avoid a savage slash, Kai's heel came down on a loose stone hidden in the sand. His ankle twisted. For a fraction of a second, his balance was gone. He stumbled, his body open and vulnerable. It was the opening Chaitan had been waiting for. He saw not a man who had slipped, but a weakness that had been revealed. A judgment from the ancestors. With a roar of triumph, he surged forward, his arm raised high, the knife a sliver of falling sky, aimed directly at Kai's exposed heart. Time shattered. For Annabelle, the world slowed to a thick, syrupy crawl. She saw the descending blade. She saw Kai, off balance, trying to bring his own knife up to block, knowing he would be too late. She saw the faces in the crowd, frozen in anticipation. There was no thought, no decision. There was only a single, primal, undeniable instinct. With a cry that was torn from the deepest part of her soul, she broke through the human wall. She threw herself forward, into the space between the two men, her body a desperate living shield for the man she loved. Shaitan's blow, driven by all his strength and fury, could not be stopped. He saw the flash of blonde hair, the white skin, but it was too late. His mind registered the impossible, but his body had already committed to the kill. The blade descended. Instead of meeting the hard resistance of Kai's chest, it met the soft give of Annabelle's side. It sliced through her rough spun shirt and deep into her flesh. A single collective gasp rose from the circle. It was a sound of profound shock, of a sacred ritual violated in the most unthinkable way. Annabelle cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain and surprise, and crumpled at Kai's feet. The world, which had slowed to a crawl, now exploded. Shaitan froze, the bloody knife still in his hand, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. The triumph in his eyes was replaced by a dawning horror. This was not the will of the ancestors. This was an abomination. For Kai, the sight of Annabelle falling, of the brilliant red blood blooming on her side, staining the sacred red sand of his home, was the snapping of the last thread that bound him to this place, to these people. The quiet, controlled man who fought with the grace of flowing water was gone. In his place was a storm. A roar of pure animalistic anguish ripped from his throat. It was a sound of such pain and fury that the people in the circle physically recoiled. He was on his knees in an instant, gathering Annabelle into his arms, pulling her protectively to his chest. He ignored Shaitan, ignored the elders, ignored the entire world. His universe had contracted to the wounded woman in his arms. He looked down at her pale, pain-filled face, then looked up at the circle of his kin, his tribe. His eyes were blazing with a fire that none of them had ever seen, a fire that burned all bridges, all loyalties, all laws. He screamed at them in the tongue of the Deni, the language of his heart, and his words were a vow that was also a curse, a final, irrevocable severing. Her life is my life. In that moment, he was no longer a son of the tribe. He was his own nation, a nation of two. A deathly silence fell over the valley. The duel was over. The judgment had been rendered. But not by any man. A woman from another world had shown them a loyalty that shamed their rigid laws. As Kai held her, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and terror, a figure broke from the crowd. It was his aunt, a small, wizened woman who had taught him the names of the plants when he was a boy. She did not speak. She did not look at the elders. She walked directly to him and pushed a small, tightly wrapped bundle of leaves into his free hand. Yarrow to stop the bleeding, willow bark for the pain. It was a small act of rebellion, a final gift of love that defied the council. Shaitan finally found his voice. It was a ragged, hollow sound, all the righteous fury gone, replaced by a terrible, shaking uncertainty. "Get out," he bellowed, the words more for himself than for Kai. "Take her and go. The desert will be your judge." But his eyes were not on Kai. They were fixed on the stain of Annabelle's blood on the ground, a stain that could never be washed away, a testament to a spirit stronger than his own. He had won the duel, but he had lost something far more important. Kai did not need to be told. He carefully adjusted his hold on Annabelle, rising to his feet with a strength born of pure desperation, without a backward glance at the silent circle, at the only home he had ever known. He turned and walked away. He carried the future in his arms, leaving the past behind him, a broken thing of blood and sand. He was in exile, banished not by law, but by love. He walked out of the canyon of his birth and did not look back. The land of his people was behind him, a place of ghosts and broken loyalties. Before him lay the open desert, a vast, unforgiving sea of sand and rock. It was a place he knew well, a place of solitude. But he was not alone. The woman in his arms was a warm, fragile weight, her life a flickering candle he had to shield against a hurricane. Her blood had soaked through the front of his trousers, a dark, damning stain that bound them together more tightly than any rope or any vow. Annabelle was a feather in the wind, drifting in and out of consciousness. Pain was a red pulsing wave that would crash over her, then recede, leaving her floating in a gray, hazy limbo. She was aware of the steady, rhythmic movement of being carried, of the solid strength of the arms that held her. She felt the sun on her face, then the coolness of shadow. She heard the low, soothing murmur of Kai's voice, speaking to her in the soft, flowing sounds of his own language. Words she did not understand, but whose meaning she felt in her bones. He was her anchor in a world that had come undone. He found a place of relative shelter in the lee of a towering sand dune, a curved basin of sand protected from the relentless wind. He laid her down as gently as a mother lays a sleeping child, his movements economical and precise. The wound in her side was ugly, a deep, clean slice from Shaitan's blade. It was bleeding sluggishly, the red sand already clinging to the torn edges of her shirt. He worked with a grim, focused intensity. He took the bundle of herbs his aunt had given him, a final, forbidden gift of kinship. He crushed the yarrow leaves between two stones, mixing them with a little water from his canteen to make a thick, green poultice, with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his raw, calloused hands. He cleaned the wound as best he could and packed it with the poultice. The yarrow stung, and Annabelle cried out, a thin, weak sound that tore at his heart. He held her still, whispering to her, his voice a low current of reassurance until the spasm of pain passed. He tore strips from the bottom of his own tunic to create a clean bandage, wrapping it tightly around her torso. She was burning with fever. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch, her breathing shallow and rapid. He knew he had to get fluids into her and bring the fever down. He used the last of his flint and steel to start a small, careful fire, feeding it with the dry roots of a dead greasewood bush. He took the pieces of willow bark from the bundle and boiled them in the small tin cup he carried, creating a bitter, dark tea. He propped her head up, cradling it in the crook of his arm. "Drink," he urged softly, touching the rim of the cup to her cracked lips. She was barely conscious, but some primal instinct for survival made her swallow the bitter liquid. He gave her as much as she could take, then sat back on his haunches, his vigil beginning. The sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, and the desert sky transformed into a vast, deep bowl of black velvet strewn with 1,000,000,000 diamonds. The stars were so bright, so close, they seemed to hum with a silent, cosmic energy under their immense and indifferent gaze. Kai felt the full weight of his solitude, of his exile. He was a man without a tribe, without a home, a single, drifting soul in an infinite emptiness. He looked at the woman sleeping fitfully by the fire, before her. This solitude had been his natural state. He had moved through the world alone, a silent observer, his heart as quiet and still as the stones of the desert. He had believed it was his nature. He had believed it was enough. He was wrong. She had crashed into his life like a falling star, a flash of impossible light and burning pain. She had upended his world, cost him everything he had ever known, and in doing so, she had given him everything that mattered. For the first time, he understood the stories the old men told, the songs the women sang. They were songs of connection, of a life entwined with another. He had always heard the music, but he had never understood the words. Now he did. He looked at her pale face, serene in the firelight, and a feeling of such profound tenderness and fierce protectiveness washed over him that it left him breathless. "Since you came," he thought, his gaze sweeping from her face to the silent, watching stones around them. "The stones have learned to speak." Annabelle stirred, her eyelids fluttering. She began to murmur, her voice a low, fevered ramble. She was back in the wagon, her father beside her, his face full of hope for their new life in the West. She felt the jolt of the attack, the screams, the terror. Then she was in the back room of the boarding house in Dusty Ford, the leather satchel in her lap, her father's letter in her hand. The words swam before her eyes, sharp and clear in the delirium. "A promise," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Safe passage," he gave his word. Kai leaned closer, trying to make sense of her fever dream. "A military man," she mumbled, her brow furrowed in concentration. "An intermediary, a name, a letter, D—" Her voice trailed off, and she lapsed back into a troubled silence. A man named D, the letter, the cavalry badge on the dead outlaw. The pieces clicked into place in Kai's mind with a cold, hard finality. Doyle, Sergeant Doyle, the man whose blind rage and prejudice had set this fire. He was not just a fool. He was a part of the rottenness. The soldiers and the outlaws were two sides of the same corrupt coin, and Annabelle was the living proof of their crime. Kai sat with this knowledge, a cold stone in his gut. As the night wore on, he bathed Annabelle's face with a damp cloth. He forced more of the willow bark tea between her lips. He watched and he waited. His entire being focused on the fragile thread of her life. He prayed to the spirits of his ancestors, the same ancestors he had been accused of shaming. He did not pray for himself. He prayed for her. He prayed for the dawn. It came, as it always did, a slow bleed of gray and then pink on the eastern horizon. With the first light came a change. Annabelle's restless tossing ceased. The frantic, shallow rhythm of her breathing deepened, becoming slow and regular. Kai placed his hand on her forehead. The fire was gone. Her skin was cool and damp. The fever had broken. He knelt there beside her as the sun rose, its light washing over the dunes, turning the sand to a sea of gold. She was going to live. The knowledge, after the long, dark terror of the night, was too much to bear. A single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. Then another. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. All the loss, the fear, the rage, the profound and aching love, it all came pouring out. He had not cried since he was a small boy. When his mother had died, he had thought that part of him was a dry and empty well. He had been wrong about that, too. When Annabelle finally opened her eyes, the sun was high in the sky. She felt weak, as if she were floating. But the pain in her side was a dull, manageable ache, and her mind was clear. The first thing she saw was Kai's face. He was watching her, his eyes full of a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. She saw the tear tracks on his dusty cheeks, and her heart constricted. "You are awake," he said, his voice soft. She tried to sit up, and he gently pushed her back down. "Rest." She lay back, a small smile touching her lips. "Did I hear you crying?" she teased gently. His face flushed, and he looked away. A rare sign of embarrassment. The smoke from the fire was in my eyes. She laughed, a weak but genuine sound. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. She tried to say thank you in his language, repeating a word she had heard him use. She mangled the pronunciation completely, the sounds coming out as a garbled mess. Kai looked at her earnest, smiling face, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his own. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows, and for a moment, he looked like a young man without a care in the world. The sound of his quiet laughter, a low, warm rumble, was a promise of a future she had not dared to believe in. When the moment passed, a comfortable silence settled between them, but they both knew it could not last. The peace was a temporary illusion. They were still being hunted. "We cannot keep running," Kai said finally, his voice serious again. "They will not stop. Crow, and this man, Doyle, they will hunt us until we are dead. A loose end." Annabelle nodded, her expression becoming grim. She touched the leather satchel that he had placed beside her. "My father's letter. It is proof. It names no one, but it speaks of the arrangement. It is enough to make someone ask questions." She looked at him, her eyes clear and determined. "We cannot hide for the rest of our lives. Hiding is not living. We have to go back. Kai met her gaze. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, unshakable resolve. Her love came with a profound sense of responsibility, not just for him but for the truth, for the memory of her family. To love her was to accept that responsibility as his own. Their survival was no longer enough. They needed justice. Back where he asked? There must be a fort, a real one, with an officer in charge who is not on Crow's payroll, she said, her voice gaining strength. Someone who will listen. Someone who will see the truth when it is laid in front of him. We have to show them the letter. We have to tell them what happened. It is the only way to put out the fire. He knew she was right. It was a terrible risk. They would be walking back into the lion's den, but she was right. To run forever was to let the darkness win. He had been exiled from his people, a man with nothing left to lose. But he had not lost everything. He had found her, and for her, he would face any danger. All right, he said, his voice a quiet vow, we will face them together. The iron rails were their guide, a hard, unyielding path cutting through a world of shifting sands and uncertain loyalties. They followed the line eastward, a journey back into the heart of the danger they had just escaped. Annabelle's strength returned with each passing day. The wound in her side was a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder of the price that had been paid for their bond. But it was healing. She walked with a new purpose, her initial fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve that mirrored Kai's own. They were no longer just running. They were hunting the truth. Kai's skills, honed by a lifetime of reading the subtle language of the desert, were now turned to a different kind of tracking. He read the signs of the railroad, the telegraph wires, the movement of the section crews. He knew that both Crow's gang and Doyle's soldiers would be on the move, their paths converging on the next big prize. It did not take him long to figure out where that would be. A high skeletal trestle bridge spanning the deep, red-walled canyon of the San Juan River. It was a place of vulnerability, a perfect choke point for an ambush, and the weekly Army payroll train was due in 2 days. They arrived at the canyon rim as the sun was setting, the iron bridge a delicate black spiderweb against a sky of fire. It was an awesome and terrifying sight, a monument of industrial certainty thrown across a chasm of ancient, natural chaos. Below, the river was a thin, muddy ribbon. They watched from a concealed position as Crow's men, moving with practiced efficiency in the fading light, took up positions on the far side of the canyon. They were preparing a trap. Annabelle and Kai found shelter in a shallow cave, the scent of dust and cold stone a familiar comfort. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs, a knife, a bow, and the damning letter in her father's satchel. Against an organized gang of killers and a corrupt cavalry sergeant, it was a pitiful arsenal. They had to rely on the one thing their enemies lacked, a desperate, unbreakable trust in each other. They watched and they planned, their words quiet whispers in the vast silence. Their strategy was a thing of poverty and desperation, woven from tumbleweeds, a train whistle, and the courage of 2 people with nothing left to lose. "Does this plan have a name?" Annabelle asked, her voice tight with a fear she was trying to control with a sliver of humor. She was tracing a map of the bridge in the dust with a stick. Kai looked from the dust map to her face, his own expression grim but steady. He reached out and brushed a stray strand of blonde hair from her cheek. "It is called Do Not Die." The next day was an eternity of waiting. As the afternoon sun began its long slide toward the horizon, they saw a second group of riders approach the canyon from the east. Sergeant Doyle and his patrol. They did not join Crow's men but took up a concealed position on the same side of the canyon, a short distance away. They were the second set of jaws in a very clever trap. Crow would spring the ambush, and when the robbery was complete, Doyle would ride in, not to capture the thieves, but to eliminate them, burying the secret of their conspiracy with their bodies. He would be a hero, praised for wiping out a notorious gang of savages. The distant, mournful cry of a train whistle drifted on the wind. It was time. From her position near the tracks, Annabelle watched the train approach, a black engine pulling a single passenger car and a heavily guarded mail car. As it began to slow for the bridge, Crow's men unleashed a volley of rifle fire, forcing it to a screeching halt just before it reached the trestle. The trap was sprung. On the far side of the canyon, Kai put a spark to a massive pile of dry tumbleweeds and brush they had spent the morning building. It erupted in a whoosh of flame and thick, oily smoke, a sudden, startling beacon in the clear afternoon air. It was a signal to no one, a fire meant only to confuse, to draw eyes away from the real action. As Crow's men were distracted by the fire, Annabelle, using the noise and chaos as cover, slipped from her hiding place and scrambled up into the engine cab. The engineer and fireman, their hands in the air, stared at her in stunned disbelief. She ignored them, her eyes fixed on the long, braided cord that sounded the steam whistle. She pulled it hard. A deafening, continuous blast shattered the air, a long, piercing scream of mechanical panic that echoed off the canyon walls. The chaos was their only ally. While the bandits were looking at the fire and shielding their ears from the whistle, Kai moved. He was a blur of motion, a desert shadow, running along the tracks and onto the bridge itself. He met Crow halfway across the narrow iron walkway. The outlaw leader turned, a look of amused surprise on his face. "Well, look what the wind blew in. I thought the desert had swallowed you whole." He held a pistol in his hand, but he made no move to use it. He was enjoying the moment. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble." "The trouble is just beginning," Kai said, his knife a dull gleam in his hand. Crow laughed, a dry, cynical sound. "You do not get it. Do you men like Doyle? Men like me. We are not the disease. We are the symptom. I sell fear. It is the only currency that never loses its value. Both sides buy it. Your people, his people. They all pay me to be what they need me to be." His words were cut short as Kai lunged. The fight was a desperate, close-quarters affair on the narrow, high walkway. A single misstep meant a fatal fall to the river below. Crow was strong and ruthless, but Kai was faster, his movements honed by a lifetime of close-quarters survival. Just as two of Crow's men started across the bridge to help their leader, a new sound entered the fray, a sharp thrum followed by the splintering crack of wood. An arrow, impossibly, had flown from the canyon rim and smashed into the front wheel of the bandits' supply wagon. The heavy wagon lurched, its axle breaking, spilling boxes of ammunition onto the ground. The horses panicked, rearing and screaming. Crow's men were thrown into complete disarray, their attention ripped from the fight on the bridge. Kai, Crow, and Annabelle all looked up at the rimrock in stunned amazement. A lone figure stood there, silhouetted against the bright sky, a bow held loosely in his hand. It was Chaitan. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were clear. He had followed them. He had watched, and he had understood. He had not come for vengeance. He had come to witness the truth, and in witnessing it, he had made a choice. At the other end of the bridge, the chaos gave Annabelle her chance. Doyle was shouting orders, trying to get his men to move in, to enact the second part of his bloody plan. Annabelle stepped out from behind the train, walking directly toward him. The younger soldiers stared, their rifles half lowered. This was the woman they had been sent to rescue. "Sergeant Doyle." Annabelle's voice was clear and steady. Cutting through the noise, she held up her father's letter. "I have a letter here that speaks of a military intermediary who was paid to guarantee my family's safe passage. A man whose influence was undeniable. Was that you, Sergeant?" Doyle's face went pale, then purple with rage. "What is this nonsense? She is delirious. She has been with the savage too long. Shoot him." But his men hesitated. They looked from Annabelle's resolute face to the letter in her hand, to their sergeant's panicked fury. They saw a conspiracy beginning to unravel. Back on the bridge, Kai used the moment of hesitation. He tackled Crow, and the two men went down hard, their bodies slamming against the iron girders. They grappled, rolling dangerously close to the edge. Kai saw a loose coil of thick rope on a nearby flat car. With a surge of desperate strength, he pushed Crow away, grabbed the rope, and in a series of swift, practiced motions, had the outlaw's hands bound tightly behind his back. It was over. Doyle, seeing his entire scheme collapsing, seeing Crow captured alive, raised his pistol. He would silence them all. He aimed at Kai's back. Before he could pull the trigger, another arrow flew from the canyon rim. It did not strike Doyle. It struck the pistol in his hand. The impact was so precise, so powerful, that the gun was torn from his grasp, clattering uselessly onto the iron tracks. Chaitan lowered his bow. His part in this story finished. He had not come to kill. He had come to deliver a justice that was cleaner and truer than any bullet. A profound silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the hiss of steam from the engine and the distant cry of the river. Crow was captured. Doyle stood disarmed and exposed, his own men now staring at him with the cold eyes of judgment. As the dust settled, a great flock of crows that had been roosting in the high ironwork of the bridge took to the air. They rose as one, a swirling, cawing mass of black wings against the blue sky, a living curtain of shadow finally lifting. The battle was won. The darkness was in retreat. The chaos on the San Juan Bridge gave way to a stunned, orderly silence. The arrival of the train's guard detail, along with the clear-eyed testimony of the younger soldiers who had witnessed their sergeant's treachery, shifted the balance of power completely. Sergeant Doyle, his face a mask of disbelief and sputtering rage, was stripped of his pistol and placed under arrest by his own men, his shouts of protest ignored. Crow, bound securely in Kai's rope, was hauled away along with the rest of his dazed and defeated gang. The conspiracy, built on a foundation of greed and fear, had been brought down not by an army, but by the courage of two fugitives and the inconvenient truth contained in a dead man's letter. In the days that followed, Kai and Annabelle camped by the river, their lives suspended in a strange limbo. They were no longer hunted, but they were not yet free. They were witnesses, required to give their account to a sober-faced captain who was sent from the nearest fort to investigate the incredible mess. Annabelle told her story, her voice clear and steady, the letter providing the undeniable proof. Kai spoke when spoken to, his words few and precise, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to the blustering denials of the disgraced sergeant. They were treated with a cautious respect, but they were still outsiders, a problem to be dealt with once the official reports were filed. One evening, as they sat by their small fire, watching the river flow, a group of figures appeared on the far bank. They were dying. Annabelle's hand instinctively went to the knife at her belt, her body tensing, but Kai placed a calming hand on her arm. He recognized the man in the lead. It was Hastian. The old man and two women from the tribe waded across the shallow part of the river, their movements slow and deliberate. They stopped a respectful distance from the fire. Hastian's ancient, wrinkled face was impossible to read. He carried a small woven basket. "We heard of the fight at the Iron Bridge," Hastian said. His English slow and careful, he looked from Kai to Annabelle, his gaze lingering on the new, clean bandage on her side. "The soldiers have many questions for our people now. The name of Chaitan is spoken with a strange respect." He set the basket on the ground between them. Inside were freshly baked corn cakes and another bundle of medicinal herbs. "I did not come to apologize," the old man said, his eyes meeting Kai's. "The law of the tribe was broken. That does not change. I came to see if you two are still breathing." Kai nodded, a deep and complex gratitude welling up inside him. It was not a pardon. It was something more profound. It was an acknowledgement. Hastian looked at Annabelle, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of a smile in his old eyes. "The heart is a strong rope, too," he said softly. Then, without another word, he and the women turned and walked back across the river, disappearing into the twilight. The next morning brought another visitor, though this one kept his distance. Chaitan appeared on the ridge overlooking their camp, a solitary, powerful figure against the morning sky. He did not come down. He simply stood there, watching them for a long time. With him was a horse, a beautiful pinto with a gentle eye and a calm demeanor. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the distance, clear and strong, a voice stripped of its rage, left only with a hard, bitter truth. "I do not forgive one who betrays tradition," he called out, his words directed at Kai. "You chose her over the people. That is a stain that does not wash away." He paused, and his gaze shifted to Annabelle. "But I owe the girl a horse," he continued, his voice softer now, and full of a grudging respect. "I owe her because her blood spoke a truth I did not want to hear. She showed me that honor is not always found in the laws of the old ways." He gave the pinto's lead rope a gentle tug, leading it down a less steep path to the river bank. He tied the rope loosely to a willow tree, giving the horse a final, lingering pat on the neck. Then, without looking back, he climbed the ridge and was gone. The horse was a peace offering, an apology, and a tool for their future. It was Chaitan's way of paying a debt of honor, of restoring the balance in his own soul. They stood by the river, the gentle pinto grazing nearby, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they looked at the horizon not as a line to run toward, but simply as the place where the sky met the earth. The chase was over. The ghosts were settled, but a question remained, vast and open as the landscape around them. What now? "We cannot go back," Annabelle said softly, voicing the thought that hung between them. Neither of us. Missouri was a place of ghosts for her, a life that no longer fit. The hidden valley was a closed door for him, a home he had sacrificed. They were a people of two, a tribe without a land. "There are homesteaders," Kai said, looking west toward the unsettled territories. "A small camp, a few families, a day's ride from here, by a stream. There is good water, good land." It was not a grand vision. It was a simple, humble one, a life on the fringes, belonging to neither world completely, but belonging to each other. They would not be reclaiming a lost past, but building a new, quiet future from scratch. They could work the seasons for the homesteaders when there was a need, and hunt and trap to provide for themselves. It would be a hard life, a life of work and sweat, but it would be theirs. "A life without running," Annabelle whispered, the words tasting of a freedom she had never known. Yes. That night, they sat by their fire, the stars above them a brilliant, silent canopy. The universe, which had once seemed so hostile and indifferent, now felt like a vast, benevolent shelter. Annabelle leaned her head against Kai's shoulder, the warmth of his body a solid, reassuring presence. The air was clean and cold, scented with wood smoke and the promise of tomorrow. "What is the name of our new plan?" she asked, her voice playful, a gentle echo of their desperate conversation before the battle at the bridge. Kai was silent for a long time, looking into the dancing flames. He thought of the long, lonely years before her, and the terrifying, beautiful, and uncertain future that lay before them now. He put his arm around her, pulling her closer. "To live long enough," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble, "to grow old together." A slow, radiant smile spread across Annabelle's face. She turned her head, her lips close to his ear. "Untie me slowly," she whispered, the words a tender, private renewal of their vow. Every morning, from the old fears. He closed his eyes, the truth of her words settling into the deepest part of his soul. "I am already yours," he breathed, a promise that was as vast and as constant as the starry sky above them. The great open country of the American West stretched out around them, the sky beginning to soften at the edges, losing its hard, black certainty and taking on the warm, gentle color of honey. In the far distance, they could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a handcar on the iron rails, a sound that was no longer a threat, but just a part of the world's quiet breathing. here, in the vast and silent landscape. Their small tribe of 2 was finally free, breathing an air that asked no one for permission, under a sky that belonged to them all. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from in the world so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.